All right, so we're ready to get started. Welcome everyone to Voices from the Field, Reimagine Learning Voices from the Field. We're excited that you all were able to join us today. You're in for a treat. Today we have David Rose, who's going to talk about variability and learner variability. But before we pass it over to David, I just want to give a brief bio for David, just to let you guys know how awesome he is. So David Rose is a developmental neuropsychologist and educator whose primary focus is on the development of new technologies for learning, especially for the most vulnerable learners. In 1984, Dr. Rose co-founded CAST, a nonprofit research and development organization whose mission is to improve education for all learners through innovative uses of modern multimedia technology and contemporary research in the cognitive neurosciences. He's also the co-author of several scholarly books, numerous award-winning educational technologies, and dozens of chapters in research journal articles. So we're excited to hear from him today about a chapter of one of the books he co-authored on the universal design for learning. And with that said, I'm going to pass it over to David. Oh, sorry, before we pass it over, if you guys have any questions throughout this presentation that come up for you, feel free to enter those questions into the chat box, and towards the end of the session, we'll open up some time for Q&A. So again, you can chat in questions, and we'll also open up the lines towards the end for Q&A. Thank you. Thank you.
Can you just tell people how they could do that? Get in the chat, post it on.
Okay, so the chat will be located at the top right of your screen. It's a chat box. So what you would do is just click in there and send. You should send to the presenter, or you can send it to everybody. I'll be monitoring it, and I'll take stock of the questions as they come in, so that way everyone's questions will be answered in the order they were received. And then towards the end, when I open up the lines, there's a raise your hand feature, and I'll explain that when we get there, but you should be all set for now.
Okay, great, thanks. And that's me. And let's talk a little bit about variability, and I'll start. So people are different, no surprise. And when we talk about the universal design for learning, in particular, we're talking about everybody. There's a feeling often that universal design for learning is about people with disabilities. It certainly is inclusive of people with disabilities, but it really means how do we design learning environments that are responsive to the diversity that we see. Let me just shut my door here. So I want to talk about variability. The old view of variability, which many of us had when we were in graduate school, was a normal curve like this with something like IQ on it or intelligence, and that was what essentially the main conversations were about variability. And I just want to point out that to neuroscientists, it's awkward to talk about something like IQ or intelligence. These don't fit well into what nervous systems do. So this is something that's been created by people who are interested in things like tests and stuff. It's not, the ideas don't come from any neuroscience or even cognitive science about what differences there are among us. But anyway, so that's the old view. The new view is much more informed by modern neuroscience, which looks at, well, how different are brains anyway? And the answer is, while there's a basic template that everybody's brain looks like, or most people's look like, they're really richly different. And the new imaging allows us to, for example, see the connectivity, which is the key thing. How is this machine connected? And it turns out that we're connected, each of us, quite differently from our friends and family even, and that those differences are the substrates for individual differences in behavior and so on. The sources of that variability are really two. One is the inheritance we have genetically, what we get, the starting foundation that we inherit. That makes a difference in how it's now called the connectome. I should have probably introduced that word. But the connectome is what is the connection pattern of your brain. And here's two different connectomes. And these are a pattern that differs by genetics. Genes made these brains look different in the way that they're connected. But another way is experience also shapes and sculpts the patterns of connectivity of our brains. So expert golfers look different than beginning golfers if you look at their connectivity. The same is true for chess players or for dancers or whatever. When you develop expertise, you're sculpting, shaping the brain, and it's primarily its connections to be a different kind of brain. And those differences are environmental differences caused by your interactions with your family, your culture, your environment. So there's two sources of variability. One source is that we don't inherit the same brain when we start, and the second source is that we don't go through the same experiences, and those sculpt different brains too. So brains end up being fairly different. In this talk, I'm going to divide up the brain into sort of its most fundamental parts, three main parts. And some of you that know UDL are already aware of this, and I apologize. But let me talk what those three parts are. And this is based on the anatomy. How does the anatomy of the brain work? So the first big section we'll talk about is what's often called recognition networks. And those are in the back of your brain, and they allow you to identify and interpret patterns of sensory information that's coming in from the environment. Things that come in through your retina, things that come in through your eardrums, things that come in through your sense of touch. All of that information that's coming in goes to the back of your brain. That's where it goes. It's very predictable. So the whole back surface of your brain at every level, from spinal cord to midbrain to cortex, if it's in the back, it's always about making sense out of information, or reacting to information from the outside world. The front of your brain is very different anatomically. The front of the brain looks different when you look at it on slides, and it is notable because it has connections primarily to the great motor systems for acting on the world. So this is the part of the brain that allows you to plan, execute, and monitor actions on the environment. Everything from walking to dancing to being strategic about your actions, being able to play high-level chess, and so on. The front part of your brain allows you to do that, to both plan and execute things that are your manipulation of the outside world, the actions you can take. And third, and probably more important in UDL with each year that we do it, is the parts of your brain that are in the middle, not visible. These others are on the surface. The interior surface of your brain is composed of the parts that set priorities for what you should attend to. Of all the things that are coming in your sensory apparatus, the things that come in visually, what should you pay more attention to? And similarly for action, of all the possible actions and strategies you could do right now, which are the important ones to do? And we experience that prioritizing as emotions. So fear changes what's important to us. Hunger changes what's important to us, and all of that. That is, it changes what we see, what we look for, and it also changes what kinds of actions we want to take. If you're very hungry, you feel unhappy, uneasy about that, and your brain starts to mobilize to say, whatever you were doing before, it's becoming more important now to look for things to eat and by smelling or looking, and to be now taking actions for how do we get some food. So this is the center of your nervous system. I think it's probably revelatory that it is at the center because it's the most powerful part of your brain. And as educators, we tend to think that we're in the cognitive science business, but we're really in the affective science business. How do we motivate kids to the kinds of things we think are important to learn? So just a little bit on at least a couple of these. Some things about this posterior part of your brain, and particularly what's different about people here. And some of you have heard me do this dog and pony show, and I apologize if you have, but it seems to be a quick way to understand how this connectome, the brain, its differences result in human individual differences in behavior and things like that. So here's this pink part you see highlighted here is in rear part of the brain, so you can tell right away, I hope, oh, it must be about taking information in. And it is. It's auditory cortex. This is where you process information coming in from your ears. I want to talk about some difference between my wife and I. That's my wife on the right, and she has what's called perfect pitch. Perfect pitch means that if you play a note of any kind, Ruth knows that it's a B flat or a C sharp or whatever. She's always right. It's not hard. She doesn't have to hum to herself. It's as automatic as these things go. For you, most likely, most of you don't have perfect pitch, so it's like color or something where you just know it's red, you don't have to think about it. And for Ruth, she can always hear it's a B flat. And I'm different than Ruth. I don't have perfect pitch. I have what's called relative pitch, and that means I can tell high from low, and I can tell one note's higher than another, and things like that. But if you play me a note, I don't know it's a B flat, most people are like that. The differences relatively recently have been found. What's the difference about our brains that Ruth has this perfect pitch and I don't? And the answer is that her brain actually looks different anatomically, the way it's connected. So the big image at the bottom is a image of auditory cortex that's highlighted in yellow to show rich and strong connections. The neurons there are connected with what I would call a superhighway, very heavily connected. A lot of information can move back and forth between the parts of her auditory cortex. That's why it looks fat. Up above, you see what my cortex, and probably yours, looks like. Thin, sometimes they call it like a country road, maybe one-lane road. Works fine. It's not broken in any way, but it can't handle a volume of traffic. It's not deeply and richly connected like Ruth's is. You can see it's very specific on the purple indicates it's just on the right side of the brain. Actually, her brain isn't any different from mine on the right side. It's just the left side where this real difference in connectivity occurs. And that's what results in her perfect pitch. And she would be described as hyper-connected. That is, there's more than usual connections in that part of her cortex. And it's only on one side. It's asymmetric, just the left side. So that's a particular kind of brain that she has, and it's different than mine. And that's the way our brains probably look. Mine, I think, is cuter than hers, but it works differently. Who has a disability is a key question for discussion later, and the answer is you can't tell just by looking at the brain. You have to know what's the context, what's the demand, what's being expected here before we can decide where the disability is and who has a disability. And to abbreviate as much as I can, Ruth is a semi-professional singer, sings in symphony halls and stuff like that, and lots of choirs. And for her, she sees me as quite disabled. Since it's so easy for her to do that and to always be on pitch, It's puzzling at first and then just annoying that I just don't have good pitch. It's made me annoying because she was hoping that we would raise children who would be great singers like her, and that they would have terrific pitch, and we'd all be able to be like a family out of the sound of music. But unfortunately, I passed on my pitch, my auditory cortex, hypo-connected auditory cortex, to our children. So we can't actually sing with Ruth, and it's a bitter disappointment to her to this day. Anyway, so to Ruth, I and her children, she now lives with a family that is quite disabled. But context matters a huge deal. And if I change the context from symphony hall or a professional choir, it can look different. So in our church, things are very different. For one thing, the organ is 100 years old, and it's actually not playing. When the organist presses the G key, it's playing an E or an F, actually. It's more than a step below where the music would say. So nobody in the congregation is singing a G when the hymn book has a G. They're all singing an E or an F or something. And not only that, but they're all singing kind of lousy like I do. We're near the pitch, but we're not really on it. So to Ruth, it's just a cacophony of all these sounds. It's just not right. And so she has a hard time singing in church. She doesn't know what to sing. Should she sing what's in the hymn book? Should she sing what the organ's playing? Should she sing what I'm singing, which isn't what the organ's playing exactly? So it's nearly impossible. So Ruth is kind of mumbles in church. And the irony for me has always been that people think, because my only time all week to sing, I sing loud and I have fun, and everybody thinks of me as a great singer, when in fact I'm actually not. And Ruth's a great singer, and they don't even know it. So I like it that they asked me to join the choir. So disability always feels like that. It's dependent not just on what our nervous systems are, but what the environment's demanding are. What is context? What kind of demands is the context making of me? And it's in that intersection between our brains and our environment that disability arises, and that's really key. And I want to talk now about the idea of a spectrum, because I think you've all heard of people with autism being on the spectrum. And this is a plug to there's a cute video, I like it actually, that Digital Promise made that has me talk about this whole phenomenon. And if you go to Digital Promise and look up David Rose, you'll find it quickly. And it uses a music analogy to talk about what a spectrum means. But let me do a little bit here. One spectrum I've kind of already alluded to, which is this one between being hyper-connected, a lot of rich connections, and hypo-connected, thin, not anywhere near as numerous and so on kind of connections. So there's a spectrum from hyper to hypo connectivity. And children with autism, just recent studies have been dramatic in showing that we didn't really understand autism in the right way. And two major papers came out in the same journal issue recently and found that children with autism are hyper-connected. In lots of places, their nervous system looks like roots. The connections are really deep and rich, more than is typical. So you see the typically developing child on the left and children with autism on the right. This is just a redrawing of the findings. But that was a dramatic finding when that came out, because usually people think of children with autism as having something broken. There's a hole in their head or something like that. But this shows that actually they have a brain that is different for sure, but it has a lot of qualities like Ruth's brain that is, it's very good at some things, actually better than most people's brains at some things, and worse at other things. And that's the way a lot of disabilities feel as well. So if children with autism are hyper-connected, this is, can't tell who's on, but in preparation for this talk, I have often said that I assume that kids who are ADHD would be hypo-connected, often given that talk and said that, but I didn't actually have any data to support that. But I decided to Google and just make sure nothing's come out recently. And sure enough, I found articles. So now there are findings that say learners with ADHD are hypo-connected, just the opposite of children with autism. The blue lines are showing areas where there's less connectivity in students with ADHD. They're lagging behind in the amount of connectivity. So there we have two groups on this spectrum, from the kind of brain that students with ADHD have to the kind of brain that students with autism, and they're on a spectrum in significant part about how richly connected different parts of the brain are. Not that they have a hole in their head or some dramatic brokenness, but that they're different kinds of brains along a spectrum. And you won't be surprised that there's people, of course, all in between here. And if we were live, I would make you raise your hands and say, which end of this spectrum are you on? Are you more like students with autism, or are you more like students with ADHD, for example? And we'd have to talk a little bit more to talk about, well, what would that mean? But it's kind of fun. But anyway, here's what the spectrum looks like, one of the spectra, from hyper to hypo, autism to ADHD. And I just wanted to, make this more dramatic by talking about two people that I am impressed with who are at these two ends. One is Tim Berners-Lee, who is the founder of the World Wide Web. So he's Sir Tim Berners-Lee, he's a MacArthur genius, all of those things. He's, will be remembered as one of the biggest inventors of the last few hundred years. Anyway, he's very ADHD. I happen to be in a men's group with him. And he's as ADHD as anyone you'll ever meet. He gets bored of his own sentences and stops, jumps off to another sentence. His particular kind of brain was probably essential for creating the World Wide Web. He and his hypoconnectivity, one of the things about it is he's looking for more stimulation. Give me more information. I don't have enough information here. And he's neophilic is a word that people sometimes use. He wants novelty, new stuff, information like crazy. And he found that when he was working as a scientist in Switzerland, that it took too long to get published reports of experiments and things like that. So he invented the World Wide Web just as a kludge to get around the fact of how long it took for information to be transferred among scientists. Because he wanted to get it right now. He didn't want to wait for a journal. He didn't want to go to a library, all those things. They just seemed way too slow for him, his impulsive way of moving about the world. So he invented the World Wide Web. What I love about it is, of course, that he made all of us more ADHD. That I'm sure you feel ADHD when you're on the web. You're more distractible, you're more impulsive, you can't read a novel on the web because you just keep getting distracted by all the other stuff. So Tim has done a guerrilla thing to make the world more like him. And it works. On the other side is Derek Pervicini, who's a concert pianist, incredibly talented. I think I'm not going to risk playing the video because I can't picture whether that would work on WebEx or not. So you're going to have to trust me, and you can look him up. Derek Pervicini is an incredible pianist, But he is also, or not but, and he is also a person with autism, and he's also blind. And so you right away think, wow, how does he play music when he can't read music, can't see any music for one thing, and he has autism. And if you take, I'll leave his name up, if you go and you Google him, you'll see all kinds of YouTube videos of him playing. And what he does, because he has this hyper-connectivity, he is richly sucking in information in ways that you aren't good enough to do, and much closer to Ruth, to be honest. So he can hear the music and all of its pitches beautifully and clearly, and one of the things about being hyper-connected is also improves not only perception of things like music or vision or whatever, but also the ability to remember it. So what he does is he only has to listen to somebody play a piece once, and he'll remember every note in it and be able to play it back to you. So he doesn't read music. All he has to do is listen to the music, and he'll be able to play it. And he's fabulous at it. He plays, I mean, he's not playing children's tunes. He's playing Beethoven and whatever. And he plays it all from this extraordinary memory that he has because he has a hyper-connected nervous system. Okay, that's him. And if you play it, it's astonishing. One more example of what we're learning about these individual differences, where the variability comes from, letter recognition. When people read, we now know and can see the difference between people who are good readers and people who are dyslexics. And you'll see the difference in green, the area, often called the word form area, where words are recognized typically. You can see it on the left, that area lights up. That's an area devoted to the kinds of things that allow you to recognize words when you see them. And in kids with dyslexia, that area is not well formed, doesn't light up on use and so on and so forth. It's not connected in the same way, and they have trouble decoding, knowing the visual patterns that lead to word recognition. But that's a spectrum. It turns out that dyslexia is, as you can imagine, all of these things are spectra, so the amount that would be here in green is going to vary between what's on the left and what's on the right. A lot for some people, not very much for others. So some people are really good at decoding, some people are really not good at decoding, and here's the spectrum. Why I wanted to bring this one up is because hyperlexia is the extreme other side of the spectrum, and there are individuals who have hyperlexia, which means they're extraordinarily good at recognizing the sound symbol correspondences of English reading. They're often precocious readers, read at ages 2 or 3 or stuff. So there are people at that end of a spectrum, as well as kids at the farthest end, kids, adults, alexia, who are far beyond dyslexia. They just really can't recognize words at all. And dyslexia is somewhere closer to that than to hyperlexia, but there's a spectrum. And if we were live, I would try to describe a little bit more about these so that you would try to locate yourself. Are you precocious in your ability to decode words, or are you more on the dyslexic end, the unlikely you're alexic? But there's a complete spectrum, like that normal curve for intelligence, but now for more interesting things. And then lastly, just to tie these two threads together, hyperlexia is very much more prevalent among students with autism. A lot of kids who have Asperger's and autism are hyperlexic, early decoders. Their troubles come with comprehension, but their brains are really well-designed, well-grown to pick up the patterns of English. Okay, that's some examples of the variability we have in this rear part of our cortex. But I just want to give maybe at least one more. If I show this pattern to two different groups of kids, I want to show you what happens. Here's the pattern, and I show it to two groups, students with Williams syndrome and Down syndrome. What's key here is that they have the same IQ. This is just to try to nail in the coffin of IQ being useful. So, equated on IQ, kids, both these now genetic syndromes, but they're looking at the same thing, and they're asked not to tell what it is, because they might not know that, but just to draw it. So the question, same IQ, blah, 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 can you draw this? And here's what happens. Kids with Williams syndrome see mostly details. They see a lot of Y's. Kids with Down syndrome mostly see the generality of it, the big picture. They see D's. So very different perceptual ways of seeing the world for people who are exactly the same intelligence, if you had to measure. Okay. I've done dyslexia a little bit, and I want to just say, I want to check my time. I'll have to maybe not do much of this, but we now know that reading is very different than we thought because of what the brain has taught us. And that what you see in color here are all the parts of the brain that actually light up, that is, burn glucose and oxygen and so on. The active parts of your brain when you read paragraphs. And all the colors are showing each sentence of the paragraphs are coded. This sentence is about a character. This sentence is about their goal. This sentence is about space. So you can probably imagine how that's done. And then they look at, for each sentence, literally, what part of the brain is active when you're reading that kind of sentence? And the answer is it's all over the brain. So it's not at all that we have this little decoding chip and that's reading. Actually, reading is a whole brain activity. Involves all the areas you see here, and even more now that we've gone a few years past this 2012 article. And what happens is that you'll see that goals are in the front of your brain, where you take action. Recognizing characters, you see the reddish color. Where is that? Back in recognition cortex, and it's where you recognize, that's the exact cortex you use to recognize people. It's just amazing. So use the same cortex used to recognize real people as be able to recognize characters in what you're reading. Fabulous use of our brains to comprehend, essentially running a simulation. You're simulating what a character looks like, and you use your regular cortex for recognizing people to do that. Amazing set of findings. But anyway, so that's what reading comprehension looks like. It's really using a lot of different parts of the brain, and those are harder for kids with autism for reasons I can't go into for the moment, but anyway, decoding, one part of reading, is often a strength, whereas comprehension is often not, primarily because they've often been overstimulated by their environments and they're not picking up as much, not learning as much to be able to understand what they're reading. Okay, and I'm going to skip a couple slides here because got to be careful here. So those are differences that have to do with that back part of your brain. Now I want to look at the front part of your brain a little bit more briefly. What are the differences among people along those dimensions? One is, and I just want to show you how we got to the UDL guidelines. So we really looked at how does the brain work and divide itself up to be able to handle human variability when we think about UDL. So in the front part of your brain, there's actually three regions. The one highlighted here in the darkish green is where you actually move muscles, take physical, simple movements. I guess that's obvious. And but these are the simplest kind of movements. UDL actually began with a student who had his difficulty with this kind of thing. Young guy named Matthew, some of you heard me talk about him before. Matthew had major difficulties with his motor outputs. So he couldn't move his arms or legs or any part of his body, actually, except his chin and his eyes. Everything else was pretty much frozen. So he has to be held up and so on. This is a very severe kind of motor disability. And so he, with that kind of difficulty, was slated to go to an institutional school because it looked like he was, in the old way, looked like he had no IQ. He couldn't talk, couldn't walk, couldn't, be toilet trained, and he couldn't do anything except move his eyes and his chin. So the school systems assumed he was profoundly retarded. But, and this is where we got to UDL, we made a switch. This is way back at the beginning. This looks stupid now, but we made a switch to put under his chin to see, well, what if we gave him a technology to use with his chin? Could we communicate with him if he could use his chin? And I won't play this video, but this just turned up in our files, and I love it. It shows Ann Meyer, one of the founders of CAST, trying with Matthew the very first time to say, use your chin to communicate with us. And we ended up teaching him Morse code and was able to write and talk, and it's just an incredibly moving experience for everybody. And then now he's finished college. So there's an example of, in the old days, we would make mistakes where we think this person is retarded. I'm using the old expression. But it hadn't had anything to do with his intellectual capacity. He had motor deficiencies, and if we could get a better technology for him to use, this little chin switch, then he could show that he was actually very smart, didn't have any kind of cognitive disabilities at all. Later, I have to say, he did turn out to be dyslexic, which I think is pretty ironic. Anyway, so that's Matthew, and he becomes a person of high, excuse the expression, IQ, if we just gave him a better output device. This part of your brain, moving a little bit forward, is the part of your brain that organizes those simple movements into larger, skillful movements. Things like walking, dancing, writing, speaking, and because they aggregate and sequence very simple movements into larger movements. So it takes a lot of cortex to organize that, and that's what this light green part of your brain does. And I'm going to skip the long dog and pony show about this, but I tell a story about being in a dance class where I'm trying to learn Balkan folk dancing. And I just had a really hard time because it turns out that in this part of my brain, I don't have a very big area devoted to moving my legs in rhythm with music and things. Just not very big there. It's like the dyslexic kids with not too much green. I'm just not built that way. My connectome isn't very strong in that area. So I had a lot of trouble, and I was in the remedial group. I was humiliated. I had trouble. I became a truant and one of the kids that acted out in the back of the class, all of those things, because this particular thing was hard for me. And the feeling I had was that everybody didn't understand that I had a very specific area of deficit. I thought, probably correctly, that everybody just thought I was a bad learner because I couldn't learn these dances, which seemed awful simple to everybody else. So that's another case where what happens with something that is a very specific kind of variability gets mistranslated into, this is a person with a real learning problem, when it really is a problem that's much more localized in the kinds of things that dances require. And last, in this front part of the brain, the very front of your brain is where we execute executive functions, and probably everybody knows about that. And this is where you plan and organize and monitor your strategies for effectively being an org. And just to bring back Tim Berners-Lee again, That's the area where he has difficulty. So he's incredibly disorganized in lots of ways. He's impulsive and all the things ADHD is. But it's not that he's not smart. He's very intelligent, super smart guy. But he's not very organized and planful and strategic. UDL, I'm going to skip a few slides. UDL would look at that along with other things to say, what do we do about kids? Let me go back, I'm sorry. What do we do to help kids who are like Tim? What do we do to help kids that are like me? What do we do to help kids that are like Matthew? Really different kinds of issues, but with modern technologies, we can actually very much provide supports for those different kids. I think, I'll just put this in as more of a joke than anything else. There are programs on the web, this one is called Self-Control, to help you be able to surf the web without being distracted when you're trying to find something. So this is just an app. You say, I don't want to be interrupted with any Facebook postings or any Gmail or anything for the next half hour. And once you put it in, it acts like a terrifically controlled executive function, and it just won't let you open up anything else, and it will allow you to keep working. So there are all kinds of things like that we can do it. Lastly, and I think I'll be getting back on track here, the middle of the brain, where we evaluate and set priorities for attention and action. Individuals are really different here too, just like in the others. And I think it's interesting that Hollywood has always gotten how important this is. So all of the Hollywood movies that are about teaching are not movies about a new technique for long division or how to think about gerunds or something like that. All of the Hollywood movies about teaching are emotional movies because they recognize that both the hard part, the challenge, and the opportunity of good teachers is to work on that affective system, to help kids by making things more important, by prioritizing them, making them things that they really want to do, things that are self-actualizing, all of that, to motivate learning. That's the hard part and the important part. So all of the movies are about that. How can you get inner city kids to want to do advanced algebra and so on? And I think the movies get it right. And we now at CAS talk about teaching is emotional work first. First and foremost, it's emotional work. That we tend to think of the cognitive work as the important part of teaching, but it comes secondary. If you can handle the emotional work and get that straight, the cognitive stuff comes very easy, much easier anyway. And that's the way the brain's built. It's at the center of the brain. You've got to engage the nervous system in learning, and then the nervous system is a terrific learning thing. In fact, I'd like to say one of the things that people often say is, well, Billy's not interested in learning or whatever. And I just want to say that's categorically an impossible thing. Your nervous system is designed by evolution and environment to be a learning mechanism. So it's not possible to stop it from learning. It learns all the time. It learns at night when you're sleeping. It learns even when you're in a coma. It is exquisitely well designed to learn all of the time. What we're trying to do is focus that learning on key things that we think are important as a culture. There's no problem with kids being able to learn. It's really just how does a good teacher focus that learning on the right kinds of things. Okay. Emotions are the things that do that focusing. And I think I'll just about done here to say there's all kinds of syndromes I often talk about that show how powerful emotions can be in determining what you learn, how you learn, when you learn, and so on. And we're all on spectra about that. That is, we are on spectra about how anxious things make us feel, to how little anxious on one end of a spectrum to very anxious on the other. We come in with nervous systems that are really quite different, And they're different genetically in that way, but they're also different by experience. Kids that have been traumatized have very different nervous systems now, and they have a very different way of approaching new things, novel things in their environment. So neophilic is the word I used once before, looking for new, very curious, wanting to find out stuff and explore in their environment. And neophobic is worried about things that are in their environment, things that are new and so on. And this is a spectrum on which we all are as well, and schools need to pay attention to it. And perhaps this is the last thing I have time for, is I wanted to talk about one of my students, Sammy Daly, who did a great thesis at Harvard, looking at what really happens when kids who are poor readers are merely asked to read in a very unthreatening situation, not in front of a class or stuff. And the answer is that just asked to read, they show an elevated heart rate. They are immediately more anxious. Just turning the page and opening it and beginning to read, they go into a state of anxiety, or more properly, a threat state. They are in the environment like our ancestor species were when they went on the savannah and they fear that there's lions around. They have nervous systems that, because of all that we have done in school and how demanding we are on text, they have learned to be threatened by showing text. So they don't have the same brain at all anymore. They have a very different brain, and we ignore that at our peril. It's not just that they may have a dyslexic kind of disability. It's that they have a nervous system which is emotionally different about reading, and that's very key to any kind of solution we would want to make. Let me close on this slide. Universal Design for Learning is about what are the evidence-based things you can do in creating a learning environment that allows you to address all the things I've been talking about in this kind of superficial way. And we spent years looking at the research to gather together what are the things that really help make good options for kids who have executive function difficulties like Tim Berners-Lee. What are the things that really help kids who have comprehension difficulties and decoding difficulties and so on, all of the different kinds of, what are the things that really help kids who have self-regulation difficulties, and also all of the things you can see. Here there are 3 principles: provide multiple means of engagement, starting with the center of the nervous system. How do you engage everybody? The answer is you can't do it the same for everybody. Their brains are really different. Secondly, you provide multiple means of representation. You can't present information the same for everybody. Some people are blind, some people are dyslexic, some people have autistic-like comprehension difficulties. They can't be treated the same way, but there are options we can use. And lastly, multiple means of action expression. When we ask kids to tell us what they know, like Matthew, some may have trouble with physical, just can't speak. And what we need then is provide options. What can you do? We made a switch so that he could do Morse code at first so that he could talk. All the way up to executive functions. What are the evidence-based options you can build into a learning environment so kids who have ADHD problems, like Tim Berners-Lee, have options from which they can be successful? Okay, I didn't get through all my slides, but it's time to stop. So I'll stop and see if there's any questions or comments or antagonisms that people have.
David, thank you so much for an amazing and engaging presentation. Folks, if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand and I can open up the line for you. And the way that you do that is you look on the lower right-hand side of your screen, right above where it says chat, you should see a hand icon. If you press that, it'll let me know that you have a question and I can unmute you. But before we get to that, a couple questions came in as you were speaking. And the first question came in from Johanna Muriel. I apologize if I didn't pronounce that right. And I think it was in reference to when you were speaking about your wife with the perfect pitch. And the fact that your kid, she might be mad at you because you weren't able to pass that on to your children. And that question was, is genetics the only root of someone's ability to identify sounds, and could someone train and develop that ability?
Okay, let me answer that. I went too fast during that section, like all of them. But I tried to hint at it at the beginning, that what your brain is now is a combination of what you inherited and what your environment shaped. So it's, I think you remember, I can't remember how I was talking about it, but that it is neither something that's made genetically nor exclusively something that is shaped by the environment. It's a beautiful combination of those two. So let me use Ruth as an example. She clearly had an inheritance pattern that was different than mine. Her brain was readier to be hyper-connected in her auditory cortex, anatomically, okay? So there was a readiness that she inherited. But if she hadn't grown up in a family where music was played all the time and had music lessons and all of that, that would not have developed. It requires both the genetic propensity and the experience to grow a brain like that. Both of them are required. And in fact, I'll give you one of the fabulous proofs of that perfect pitch is more prevalent in some cultures than others. And you may say, well, maybe that's genetics, but actually it's not. What it is that some cultures have a much higher importance on pitch in the language. And if you have a language that requires pitch differentiation, then in fact what happens is more brains grow up being perfect pitch because it's important to the culture. For example, in Chinese culture, there's a lot more people with perfect pitch. And there's ones that are more pitch-related than Chinese. So it is both genetic propensity and environmental, interaction that really shapes the brain to be what it is. It's shaped by both things the same way. So I like to think we're teachers because we are trying to shape kids' brains. We're environmentalists, and it is very powerful how much you can shape a kid's brain. So if there's no music, there's no teaching of music, you will not get perfect pitch.
Cool, thank you. All right, so we have another question that came in from Devin Ciampa. Once again, I apologize if I pronounced your name wrong. But the question is, can strategic action and expression be altered if extreme trauma is experienced during the child's developmental years?
And yes, great question. In fact, all three of the networks I talked about are changed by trauma, I'm quite sure. And you can see why that would happen. Let's take the affective networks. They get changed by trauma. I think that's obvious. If you grow up in an environment where fearful things happen, your nervous system becomes much more attuned to things it should be afraid of and watch out for. If your father beats you when he gets drunk and gets home, your nervous system is going to grow to be a nervous system that is incredibly watchful of what might happen when a father comes home drunk and looks to avoid that at all costs. So that is immediately a different brain that grows up. And there's other people that talk a lot about this. I should recommend, there's a really powerful book called The Body Keeps the Score, which is about what trauma does to the nervous system. But it changes that affective network. But as I hinted before, it also changes the kinds of things that you find important to learn. So, for example, on the information side, the back part of your cortex also changes because you're more vigilant about some things than others. That the world isn't the same anymore for you, that you're looking for patterns in the world that would help you predict when it's probably not fair for me to use that example, but more patterns will predict that, Friday nights, that's when he gets drunk. So you become good at some patterns because your brain is desperate to be able to predict that. And similarly, you develop strategies. What do I do to avoid this traumatizing father? And so more of your brain gets taken up with strategies and actions you can take rather than learning how to play chess or something like that. So it changes your brain in all three of the regions I've talked about. By the way, no one's ever asked that, and I've never even said that publicly, but it's absolutely true, I'm sure. Anyway, if you want to just really get the powerful image of that, read The Body Keeps the Score.
Cool. Thank you. All right, we have another question that came in from Rob Lippincott. Rob asks, how do we individualize or personalize curriculum when all learners are at different points on all of these spectrums?
Well, that's part I kind of ran out of time. We, at CAST, where I work, we really look hard at what new technologies can do to help us do this. Old technologies like print are one size fits all. Everybody's got to do the same thing. Everybody's got to have vision. You've got to be able to see the stuff. Everybody's got to have decoding ability. You've got to be able to decode all the words. Everybody's got to have good vocabularies. You won't understand it. One size fits all. Everybody's got to be the same to get through text. In a digital world, we can make all of that variable. And I'll recommend a book to talk more about this. But in a digital world, we can make the learning environment be as different as the kids are. So we and lots of people have made, in fact, all of you have now, your cell phones are reading devices. If you have text in your cell phone, it reads itself aloud now. So that's great for a person who has vision loss, because now vision isn't critical to reading. It doesn't stop you from reading. Similarly, for dyslexic, the word reads itself aloud. So you could get to comprehension without going through decoding, your weakest part. And if you've grown up in an environment where you didn't have good vocabulary development, you click on words like you do on your Amazon books and so on. You just point at the word and say, what does that word mean? So it doesn't have to be in your head anymore. It doesn't have to be a barrier anymore. There are more ways to get to understanding, as an example, and similarly for each of the three networks I'm talking about. So we are cautious to say it's not necessary to use technology to do UDL, but it sure helps enormously to get around a lot of the barriers that kids face, and that's a whole other talk. But if you go to the CAST website, you'll see lots of examples. We have a book that's free, by the way, that I forget whether myself or Ann Meyer is the lead author, but Rose and Meyer, or Meyer and Rose, Theory and Practice of Universal Design for Learning, and it will give you some examples. Cool,
thank you. All right, so we can just take this last question that came in from Johanna Muriel. She asks, just as Matthew was helped through technology to cope with central sulcus cortex deficit, is it possible to counteract any of these levels of connectivity, hippo or hipper, so that a person develops a more hippo or hipper nerve connectivity that leads to Down syndrome or ADHS? Are there any cases that you could name?
So that's a really hard question. The answer is that brains change much more than we used to think by teaching and learning. I flipped through a slide really quickly that showed that if you can look at an expert golfer's brain and a novice golfer's brain, and they look different. So you literally are rewiring your brain by developing expertise. So if you come in and you don't have strength in an area, yes, you can develop it. The key thing, the slide I skipped over, is you have to determine what are the side effects of that treatment. So let me take reading, because it's a scary example to a lot of people. But hopefully you're familiar with something like Orton-Gillingham. It's a really terrific intervention to help kids who are dyslexic learn to decode words, and it really works. But it takes years, not days, and like any good treatment, like penicillin, like x-rays, whatever they are, they will have side effects. And the side effects have to be weighed. And one of the side effects is typically that kids are taken out of other things. They're taken out of history or science or art or whatever to do the remedial decoding. And that means that they're falling behind in other things. So that's a side effect that has to be really weighed. So we say, yes, work on the decoding, but, and you will reshape the brain. And by the way, now it's very clear, you reshape the brain by doing that. But what we say is use the technology so that kids can continue to, at their grade level, learn history, science, geography, all of those other things that they need to learn. Because the technology now gives you a completely other set of alternatives for doing that, so the kids aren't falling behind in other things. And that is the change of universal design for learning. It's saying we don't have to make there one route to get there, and we have more routes now, and we should use them to make sure that not only are we addressing kids' weaknesses, but we better be addressing their strengths. They may be a really poor reader and a great historian, a really poor calculator in math, and a great mathematician. In the old days, that wasn't possible. Now it's very possible, and we need to allow kids to become experts at things, even if they don't have some of the sub-skills. And that's where the technology can be very powerful.
All right. Thank you so much, David. We want to thank you for taking time out of your day to come share this insight with our network. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for Voices from the Field. If this is your first time joining, we do this monthly, every other Tuesday. Stay tuned for an email with details from this session. David, if it's okay with you, I'll share your contact with people who have additional follow-up questions. And yeah, we look forward to learning and building and moving forward. Thank you so much, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Mm-hmm.